All right, so welcome everybody. Can everybody who's here hear me? Okay. Yep, good. Because I'm actually down in North Carolina, so we're doing my week in the winter time to get down here to the beach and actually pretend like I'm not working, but of course I am. So anyway, so if the sound's a little bit different, that's why. All right. So the purpose of these meetings every week is to really just see if you've got any questions as you're working through the program. If you have any issues, any technical issues, we can try and work those things out. You should have at this stage gone through chapters 1 through 3. So that's where we should be at now. I think then for the next week, we're dealing with chapters 4, maybe a little bit into chapter 5 for next week by this time. So just to keep you on track, make you aware that, are you behind? Are you ahead? Whatever. The idea with the online program is you can work at your own pace. Hopefully you're not having any issues. In fact, I just had one guy who's going through the program, didn't realize there was audio because had the volume turned off and said, oh yeah, got through that one pretty quick. So anyway, so yes, you should have audio on that. I've mentioned before that sometimes like with Google and with Apple, it can be a delay. Like as you move from one side to the other, it doesn't automatically start playing. So you got to hit the little play button, which is annoying. But if you use Edge or Mozilla or an Android phone, all of those should work okay. And the Google and the Apple are intermittent. So I don't know if it's still a problem. It seems like every time somebody updates the software in the browser or whatever, things change. So, all right. So chapter 1 is just kind of introduction. And so there's a little bit of background material. So there's nothing really difficult in there. Chapter 2, I'm going by my memory. Oh, there we're talking about cells, cell size, the various issues there. And I think the thing that people usually have problems with on that have to do with standard test conditions, the VOC, VMP, ISC, IMP, those settings on the IV curve. So did anybody, was that confusing to anybody? A struggle when you talk about what are you measuring on the different cells? How is that being measured? So ideally, this will be a bit of a conversation as opposed to everybody just waiting. So
I think for me, it's a lot of information to absorb at one time. So it's like when I get to the quiz, I have to backtrack and say, okay, what was that? Where was that? So I think it's going to take some repetition before I totally absorb it.
Yeah, and that's one of the advantages of this format. I think you can replay it 4 or 5 or 6 times, however many times you need to, however much time you have. It always feels to me it's like you're trying to learn French in 6 weeks. It's a whole new language and different terminology, and it's not difficult, but it's like, gosh, what was the word for morning? It's like you just have to, so what is the difference between IMP and an ISC? Yeah, that's, for me, of course, it's now common. I've done it a million times, but for you, this is the first time you're running across it. And the terminologies aren't always straightforward. If I say amps at the maximum power point, you might think that must be the maximum amps, but it's not the maximum amps because ISC, amp short circuit, is the maximum amps. And it's just that the amps when the panel's producing the most watts. And so you can see why it's easy to get confused because maximum doesn't mean maximum. It means maximum power, but not maximum volts, not maximum watts. And of course, by the end of it, you're just so confused you want to go back to bed and do something else. But we do repeat that particular thing over and over quite a lot in other chapters as well, because it's a fundamental thing that you've got to understand. Fortunately, you don't have to calculate any of it. You're given that with the panels. You know, you don't have to try and figure out what is the ISC, what is the IMP. Those are always going to be given to you by the panel manufacturer. You just have to know why you need to know it. So that's an issue there. The other thing that we talk a lot about, I don't think we're into it yet. When we get into resistance and voltage drop, you know, that's another concept that we'll harp on a bit. But chapter 2 really talks a lot about the specifications of solar panels, you know, and why those are important. And I think the main takeaway from that is, I would say, the extremes, the VOC and the ISC, which is the extreme amps and the extreme volts, neither of those are conditions that should be in the real world. You know, because if you notice on the IV graph, anything times 0 is going to be 0. So at those two extremes, you're producing 0 power. If you're at the VOC or if you're at the ISC, you're producing 0 power. The reason why they're important is those are important for design specifications. So when we're designing the wiring system, we want to take the worst case scenario for amps, the theoretical maximum number of amps, which would be ISC, and we want to design our wire based on that. So we're going to take the worst case scenario and make sure our wire is robust enough to handle the worst case scenario. Then when we're dealing with VOC voltage, we're going to say, okay, that's the worst case voltage. So we're going to design our systems so they don't exceed the limitations that are imposed on us by government. Like at a residential level, you're not allowed to go over 600 volts. At a commercial level, you're not allowed to go over 1,000 volts. So you take that worst case voltage and say, okay, I'm going to factor all of that when I'm designing it. So those two extremes are for design, but the IMP and the ISC, that's the actual amps and the actual volts. So we do that just to monitor our system to see how it's performing. So those are the reasons we're worried about those particular things. One is what it's actually doing under standard test conditions, and the other are the extreme maximums that it could do theoretically. And we use those as part of the design criteria. And all of that is given to us by the panel manufacturers. It's also important to understand that with the IV curve, there is basically an infinite number of curves. The IV curve that we look at is under standard test conditions. Well, standard test conditions is 1,000 watts per square meter, 1.5 atmospheres, and 25 degrees Celsius temperature. But if those conditions change, you get a different curve. And so there's an infinite number of changing conditions. So there's an infinite number of curves. And so that maximum power point is continually moving around as the temperature changes, as the radiance changes, as all of these things change. Where it's producing the most power is always moving about on that curve. So the device that's built into any charge controller or inverter, called the maximum power point tracking device, is constantly adjusting so that the panel is producing at the best point it can produce under the current circumstances that it's facing, under the current environmental circumstances. So that's where that comes into play. Every inverter or every charge controller is going to have an MPPT device built into it, so it's going to automatically track, so that it's always producing at its best potential. So that's always good. Otherwise, it would be a pain to have to try and figure out, how to make it work at its best. And let me think what else is in there in that chapter there that we.
Hey Jay,
Yeah.
this is Ted. I have an off-grid system right now. One of the reasons I took this course was to learn more about it. Two things. Well, one in chapter 1, I don't think the links to the NEC are up to date. They said I had free access and I could see the chapters, but they wouldn't, you couldn't view the actual any section of the code, although you could go to a section of the code.
Yeah, I
Um,
remember somebody else told me that I need to go in and dig deep. I think the NEC actually stopped letting you have free access. You know, it's like they decided to be mercenary about it, but I'll have to see if I can get around it. Used to be you could wander through there and it was really wonderful, but
yeah.
yeah, I'll double check on that.
But anyway, to your earlier point on so I was able to. I didn't have a great experience on having my system installed by the installer. Nevertheless, I have what I have, and I had to go to. I just recently went to the internet, and based on this stuff in chapter 2, I downloaded the technical specs of my panel, and I have a good set of panels just from what I've been looking at right here. So the other thing that I wasn't sure about, and I vaguely remember asking our installer the question, how did he determine how many panels to put in?
Mhm.
And I mean, he put in what he put in. I just sort of trusted it. I think it's okay. I don't think it's a terrible thing, but what made it, what triggered my mind was the temperature coefficient and how I could determine how many panels you end up, it might limit or enable you to put more or fewer panels in series before you hook it up to your array.
Yeah.
So I've got,
Yeah,
if you got two separate,
you're
go ahead.
kind of jumping ahead to chapter 7, really, when you start talking about putting strings together. What kind of system do you have? You have a do you have a MPPT charge controller in there? Like does it come
I have
in at a certain voltage?
it's a Solar. I've got a Solar inverter. It's a fairly new one, so I think everything's embedded in there. I'm
Yeah,
looking
yeah.
in chapter 3, so I don't know which components inside, but they've consolidated on. Looks like it's the charge controller, the MPPT. It's even got a battery. I think it's working with a battery monitoring system.
Yeah.
I got simply and the panels are Panasonic 330 watts.
Boy, yeah,
They're
you got a
amorphous.
primo system.
Uh, so anyway, I guess it is what it is. But the challenge for me is now I have to go back and say, what do I really have, and
Yeah.
how does it
Okay.
work?
Well, that would be good. Is maybe what we could do next time. Next week, if you could send me some pictures and the specs of what you've got,
Sure.
maybe what we could do is walk through that and see, did this designer design it properly? You know, is it how would I reconfigure it if it's wrong? You know, I mean, it sounds like you've got some good product. I mean, Panasonic is top of the line solar panels. Solarc is the standalone system I would recommend. And what kind of battery are you using in there?
Simplify. I got
Simplify.
6 Simplify battery systems.
Yeah. No, I
There's
know. They're lead acid batteries, right?
no, they're LiFo. They're
Oh,
lead
okay.
iron phosphate
Okay.
oxide batteries.
All right. So
Um,
yeah, that's maybe we'll have to look at the spec sheets on those as well. Just to see. Is your system 100% off grid? 100%?
100% off grid. I have 2 standby generators that are kind of one diesel and one propane. And the way they hook them up is that for the inverter, that is the grid, the simulated grid. That's how the
Yeah.
generators are accessing load. So I frequently watch the monitor to see, like today is a cloudy day. I'm kind of amazed how much power it does get. But the challenges on the inverter, it's really deciphering how much power is going to the battery. It's like the batteries represent a big barrel of power capacity, and it tells me I have 52, 47, 54 volts, but I don't know if it's the last bit of it or the whole thing is up to that level. I don't know how much is in the batteries, and it's hard to tell.
Okay. Well, it's interesting because at the end of this particular class, actually May 4th and 5th, we're going to be installing a Solarc system there at Eastern West Virginia Community College. So So you're going to have a head jump on us, but we're actually going to be doing an outdoor pavilion with a Solarc and a home something. I forget the name of the battery bank, but it's a lithium ion battery bank as well. So yeah, that'd be great. It'll give us a head start, sort of analyzing your system and tearing it apart and figuring it out. But you're right, the Solarc does contain quite a lot of the various components that are built into that, you know, like the charge controller and the DC disconnects and the AC disconnect and all of that are all in the same unit.
Mhm. Okay.
All right, yeah, it'll be curious to see how they've got it configured. It sounds like he picked the right product anyway, because everything you just said is good quality product. So it's not like I mean, I don't know what he charged you. It's probably pretty expensive system, but
It was.
yeah, that's unfortunate. That's, you know, the standalone systems are pricey for sure. And when we talk about $3 a watt for systems on average, those are simple grid tied systems. But if you start getting into a standalone system, you might be approaching $8, $9, $10 a watt by the time you've added in all your batteries and everything. So if you've got a 5 kW system, for example, you might have paid $15,000, or not 5 kW, but you know, yeah, I mean, you might pay that much for a relatively small system.
It's a 4 kW system. I think that's about what the next panels produce right now.
Yeah,
I have 12 of them, so
12 panels?
that's as most as I can get is that 4 kW.
Yeah, it sounds like exactly the same size. Do you have a 5 kW inverter from Solarc?
No, I think it's the it's a 12. I think it's a 12 kW.
Whoa, a 12 kW and you've got a 4 kW array?
Yeah.
Oh boy. Yeah, he oversized the inverter for sure. You could have easily got by with a 5 kW inverter for sure.
Well, I do run out of power though.
Yeah, well, that's because you don't have enough panels. I mean, do you have space?
Or enough batteries.
Yeah, well, I mean, it may be the panels. We'll have to look at that, because with a 10 kW inverter or a 12 kW inverter, you should be able to go to about a 15 kW array. So you should be able to, you know, 4 times the size of the one you've got. And the battery bank, what kind of capacity do you have on the battery bank?
It says 75 amp hours each, so I have 6 of them. So it's only what, 475 or something like that.
Are each one of them 12 volts?
Yes.
But it's a 48 volt system, isn't it?
That's one of the things I'm not sure.
Yeah, that sounds weird. You should have multiples of 4 for those batteries. Logic.
No. Nope. I definitely have only 6.
Yeah, they might be. Well, we'll have to look at it. Yeah, send me the specs. This sounds interesting. We might be able to improve your system dramatically if it's configured that way. So
okay.
yeah. Of course, it may make you go out and buy 2 more batteries, but you know what the heck. See, you're going to say, "Oh, I'm going to save some money by going out and spending more money." So, okay, so yeah, then we get into then chapter 3, where we're talking about different types of systems, and so of course the main types of systems we touched on is grid tied systems, and simple grid tied systems don't have any battery. They use the grid as a unlimited sized battery. You know, if you have extra power being generated, it goes to the grid. If you have need power, like at night, you can draw from the grid. So just think of the grid as a unlimited battery. And so you're not having to pay for the battery. Now, unfortunately, the utility companies are starting to push back against people using solar, because before, not enough people were involved. They were like, yeah, whatever those Prius driving, tree hugging people, that's fine. You guys can do whatever you want to do. Well, now, because solar is becoming such a thing, it's an existential threat to the utilities. So they're starting to push back on it. So the movement recently is, we'll sell you power at retail, but will only buy the power back from you at wholesale. So that becomes problematic because I'm paying, say, 18 cents a kilowatt hour or 20 cents a kilowatt hour from the utility, and they're only paying me 4 or 5 cents a kilowatt hour when I'm selling it back to them. And that discourages solar development. So what ends up happening is you say, all right, well, tell you what, why don't, instead of me selling it back to them, why don't I incorporate batteries into my system and store the power when I have excess and then use it when I need power? And it's not that you ran out of power, that the grid went down or whatever. You're just self-consuming. So you're saying in the middle of the afternoon, I'm going to store a lot of power in my batteries. But then in the evening, when the sun goes down, I'm going to use my batteries first before I use the grid. And I'm just going to use up the power I stored so that I didn't sell it to them for 4 cents and then buy it back for 20. I'm going to just keep it and use it every day. So that's self-consumption. Then there's other pricing schemes the utilities are putting in where they say, I'm going to charge you one price when demand for electricity is low, like in the middle of the night, but then I'm going to charge you a higher price when demand for electricity is high. So when you're in a situation like that, and I don't think that's the case in West Virginia right now, but it will be eventually. In some states, Colorado, California, that's the norm. And you'll say, all right, well, then if you're going to charge me, I'll give you an example. In Hawaii, in the early evening, they charge 55 cents a kilowatt hour for electricity in the early evening. But then in the middle of the night, they're only charging like 12 cents. So if you put batteries into your system, use up the batteries in the early evening, and then you could even recharge them from the grid or whatever at night. That's fine. You know, so use power when power is expensive and then recharge it when power is cheap, or recharge it from your array. So these are some of the reasons why people are installing batteries over and above the fact that the grid is unreliable. You know, that's been the normal reason, is the grid keeps going down. So I want battery backup in case the grid goes down. That's sort of the normal reason to have an AC coupled or a DC coupled system. But now we're starting to see self-consumption, time of day pricing. And then at the commercial level, they have another thing they call demand charge reduction. And demand charges is for a commercial entity. They basically say, okay, the 15-minute portion of the month where you are consuming the most electricity for that 15-minute interval, that is the rate that we're going to bill you at. And the more that you've consumed for a brief period of time, the higher your bill is going to be. And their argument is, let's say that your consumption goes along and then it spikes up and then it goes back down and then it spikes back up. They're saying, well, whatever the maximum was, we have to have the infrastructure there to supply it. So therefore, that's costing us money. So it doesn't matter how long you use it, I've got to have infrastructure there to supply that. So then what commercial entities are doing is saying, okay, rather than having power consumption go like that, then we turn on a motor and it kicks up, and then we go along and we turn on another motor and it kicks up. Why don't I use batteries to service those spikes and then recharge them slowly over the course of the month? So that's known as leveling or demand load leveling or the like, and it can drastically reduce the amount of your electric bill. So these are kind of the main reasons for incorporating batteries. The problem is, once you incorporate batteries, you've got to have a system where you disconnect from the grid, because you don't want to be feeding power back onto the grid when the power is out. You know, that's islanding. So you want to make sure you're not going to electrocute people working in the power grid by feeding power out there. So you've got to have an automatic disconnect or a smart switch or an auto transformer or whatever they call it. There are different terms for these. But those pieces of equipment have to sense when the grid goes down, disconnect from the grid, and now you go into standalone mode. So that's an auto transformer, an automatic disconnect. Those things can be kind of pricey. For example, with Enphase, their auto disconnect or their smart switch is $2,500 just for that piece of equipment. So if you're installing a system and you figure the whole system is going to cost you $10,000 in equipment costs, but then you add another $2,500 just for this disconnect switch, that starts to add up. So those are, but that's becoming the norm. Right now, I think it's like 11% of installs incorporate batteries or have some sort of AC or DC coupled systems. But that's going up and up and up all the time. And it's largely because utilities are making life more and more difficult for their customers through their pricing scheme, through their quality of service, whatever. So we end up with another thing that you can sell if you're out there installing your systems. Eventually, what I think the utility is going to do is make it to the point where we go, well, you know what? You're making life so difficult. I don't think we need you anymore. Let's just go off grid. Let's just go independent of the utility because you're making our life. If you've already incorporated batteries because of these things, it's just one small step, as Ted indicated, of just going fully independent and say, I'll add a couple more batteries and now I don't have to worry about the utility at all. So that's kind of where they're moving you to. So Ted, why did you guys, are you in a place where there is no electric?
That's correct. In fact, we actually approached the power company and say, what would it cost to get grid here? There's what's a telephone pole cost? $1,500 a piece?
It can be
Those
more.
30-foot poles?
It can be more.
It can be more.
Yeah.
The cost to become grid tied totally ran in a neighborhood, started at about $100,000.
Oh yeah.
It was 90,000 just to get it to the road, out, the driveway of the property, and then have to run it to the property and then tie it to it. So excluding the cost of going from the pole of the road to my house was about $90,000 to $100,000 just to do that. So I said, okay. So even the cost of the off-grid system I have was like 3 times less than that. Well,
Yeah.
it's only 30% of that.
Yeah. So, but a $30,000 system is an expensive solar system for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I have a farm, 3 high tunnels, all off grid, it's all, it's non-powered, so it's unheated. So we kind of manage it a unique way. But yeah, it's, and it's not getting any cheaper.
Yeah. Well, we've got Blue Rock Station where I live is we have an earthship. So it's basically it's not off grid, but it is very self-reliant, and we've got a high tunnel and stuff. So I can sympathize with what you're dealing with. One of our former interns is like rehabbing a house up in New York, and they ran into the same thing where essentially they're maybe 800 feet from the road or something like that, and the utility wants $25,000 to bring power to the house.
Yeah.
So at that point he's going, you know what? I may as well just put in a standalone system. So
I don't think the power companies are going to survive with that model. They're going to have to kind of rethink. I don't know what it's going to be, but that's just not feasible anymore, particularly when you see major power plants starting to go offline simply because of age and reconstruction. They're going to have to figure out something, because the economical choice for them is to reluctantly, if they will, put on more renewable sources of commercial level utility power to the grid.
Yeah, to me, and I've spoken with some utility people, I feel like they need to change the way they view their company. Currently, they view themselves as energy providers. They provide electricity. Well, the problem is in today's market, I can do that for myself. I don't need you to provide me with electricity. What you're providing is actually electrical connectivity. And it really is you should be looking at how can you provide services that can only be provided to a homeowner through interconnectivity with other people who are using the service. It's kind of the internet of electricity. You know, I can be a standalone entity, but if there are services out there, and I don't even know what they are, and I don't know what they'll be, but they will be, you know, it's like maybe security systems that want to monitor the health and well-being of every single appliance in your home, or you know, ways that your devices can communicate with the manufacturer so that they can schedule their own maintenance and upgrades and software upgrades and all this other stuff that you can't do when you're in a standalone mode. But the utility facilitates that because you're interconnected with other people.
Agreed.
So that's the model that they have to approach. And energy delivery is the smallest bit of that. You know, yeah, make it good for me to buy power from you, or I'll provide my own. I don't care. It's the other services that I might find of
Yeah.
that. So
So the value of the grid providing energy, given the episodic supply of renewables, be it wind or solar, you know, in the ideal world, I can extend my day to midnight if I can draw power from sunny California,
yeah,
and vice versa. You know,
sure.
they could draw power. That's where a large grid would become. That's where they would facilitate a better situation for everybody, and then it can tap into the incredible number of growing distributed energy sources. Like,
yeah, and the bigger the system, the more resilient it is. But then when you start adding in, you know, 50 million electric vehicles all plugged in that form a distributed storage system, where you can rely on these EVs bidirectionally to form battery backup for the entire grid and create virtual power plants and microgrids and all of these other things. That's the world we're moving to. We're entering into this change as profound as the change was from plain old telephone, you know, the old telephones you had on the kitchen wall, to this world that we live in today of cell phones and data and internet and Google and Facebook and social media. All of that has happened in the last 2 or 3 decades. Well, electricity is entering into a transformative period similar to what we went through over the last 2 or 3 decades. How that's going to evolve is anybody's guess, but it is that interconnectivity that's going to facilitate that. So, you know, that's really what they should be focusing on.
mm-hmm.
But they're not going to, because I was going to say they're too stupid, but they're really, their mindset will never be able to compete with the new players who are coming into the energy field. If you look at who are some of the people who have already applied to be utilities, Google, Facebook, Amazon, Intel, all of these companies are now utilities, and they will become the provider. Tesla is already looking at becoming a utility provider through virtual power plants of all of their cars hooked together. You know, so somebody like Duke or AEP or First Energy or any of those guys, these guys, they don't have the mindset to compete in this new reality. They'll go by the way. What they'll be infrastructure maintenance companies to facilitate all the stuff that these other people are doing. They'll be in charge of that distributed power system, you know, the wires. That's what they're going to do. They're going to be in charge of the distribution network. So, and good, because they don't deserve to live. You know, we need to kill off these utilities because they're annoying and they're horrible. So, and of course I'm sure we've got 3 guys who work for utilities on the call. So they're all upset now. So, all right. So those were the 3 main chapters there. And of course, we also do load analysis in that 3rd chapter. That's in addition to the main types: off-grid, grid-tied, and then AC coupled and DC coupled. Oh, I was going to mention one more thing about AC coupled versus DC coupled, because these are slightly different systems accomplishing the same thing. Because with a grid-tied system, when the grid goes down, you're disconnected and you don't have any power. That's the way it works. Well, then you say, but I don't want that to be the reality. I'd like to have power when the grid goes down. At that point, you need a DC coupled system or an AC coupled system that acts like a grid tied system when the grid is working. But when the grid goes down, it disconnects from the grid and acts like a standalone system. So that's the best of both worlds, but it's a little bit expensive. So, compared to a simple grid tied. So why would you do an AC coupled versus a DC coupled? Well, the DC coupled is pretty straightforward. Panels generate DC power. It goes into your inverter, and then if you have extra power, the DC power goes to the battery, which stores DC power. So you've got two power sources of DC, the battery and the panels, and those are feeding an inverter that then convert it to AC to service the load. So it's pretty straightforward. There's only one conversion from DC to AC, and that is to service the load. So normally, if you're building a system from scratch, you would build it that way with a DC coupled system. But AC coupled systems initially came into play if you already had a system installed and now you want to put batteries. So I've got my system and all of my power has already been transformed into AC. And now I want to add some batteries. Well, what has to happen? Now the battery, the AC power has to be converted to DC to service the battery. And then it has to be converted back from DC to AC to service the loads. So you end up going through three different transitions. Yeah. Is that Ted who said that?
This is Ted, yes.
Yeah.
Does that mean that, is this like the situation where someone has added a grid-tied solar-powered system, trying to rely on the grid being the battery, but then determining that they would rather now add batteries to that situation? Is that the typical AC coupled situation?
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, and so it usually has been a retrofit where you say, okay, I've got my typical grid-tied array, it's already there, but now I need to take that AC power, convert it to DC, and then convert the DC to AC to use in the load. So you usually added another inverter, and it was an inverter converter kind of thing, where you took the AC output of your system and fed it into your batteries and then took that, and then that served critical loads. So a little bit complicated on how to do it. And you would think, okay, well, we're taking DC, converting it to AC, then taking the AC, converting it to DC, then we're converting the DC back to AC to use it in the load. That feels very inefficient. And when the conversion process took up 10% of your power, it was prohibitively inefficient. You'd lose 30% of your power through all of those kind of back and forth conversions. Today, you're talking about conversions that are 1 to 2% efficient loss. So if you've got an inverter that's only losing 2% in that conversion, doing it 3 times, now you've just lost 6% of your power. It's acceptable. It's acceptable loss limits. Not ideal, but still acceptable. But that said, that was the original AC coupled systems. Well, now Enphase, which is the major supplier of microinverters, has wanted to incorporate batteries into their system. Well, microinverters attach directly to the panel. So the panel goes through the inverter right at the panel. So there is no DC system at all. It leaves the solar panel, is immediately inverted, and is an AC system. So if I want to put in batteries, I've got to take that AC, convert it to DC, and then re-invert it back to AC in order to use it. So Enphase's system, when you buy a battery pack, that battery pack actually has additional microinverters built into it. So the power from the AC gets converted to DC, like through a normal battery charger, and then goes back through these other little microinverters that are built into the unit. So it's an AC coupled system, but it's designed from the get-go as an AC coupled system. And of course, each of those conversions is only a loss of about 1%. So it's a very good, very efficient system, but a little bit expensive, kind of pricey as far as the industry is concerned. So, Brian, did you have a question?
So is that kind of how my camper works as far as if I'm hooked to shore power, that's a 30 amp service, which will charge the battery, my deep cycle battery. But if I unhook from shore power, then the battery services the necessary loads then. Is that correct?
Is in your camper, are those DC loads or are those AC loads that are being serviced?
Both. The
Yeah.
panel, the breaker panel has like typical automotive breaker, you know, a fuse, but then you also have little breakers like in a house. It's just
Yeah.
when you're operating on the battery, there's only certain things that will work, like a 12-volt water pump
Yeah.
and a few lights and you're not going to run the air conditioner off your typical RV deep cycle.
Yeah, yeah. I hesitate to say that it's an AC coupled. It sounds more like it's a standalone system, but with an inverter charger. So it would be similar to hooking a generator into a system that's a standalone, except that in this case it's the grid that is the generator. So you're feeding your system with the grid as a generator, which generally is coming in at AC anyway. So with a standalone system, you're going to have what they call an inverter charger, where it can both take AC power from a generator or from the grid, charge your batteries, but then it takes the power from the batteries and inverts it into AC. So it's just a combination inverter charger as opposed to an AC coupled system. So,
Okay.
but we're seeing more and more AC coupled systems, largely because Enphase is a very dominant company at the moment in residential solar. Of all of the residential systems that are installed nationwide, Enphase represents about 50% of them. So if you want to incorporate batteries, it's going to be an AC coupled system. In my office building in Marietta, we put in an AC coupled system. We put in an Enphase system, and it was from day one. It wasn't a retrofit. So it's a top of the line, it's premium kind of thing, but it works very well. The other major one, the major DC coupled system that's out there for residential, is a company called SolarEdge. And SolarEdge represents another about 40% of all of the residential systems installed nationwide. So between Enphase and SolarEdge, that's about 90% of all of the residential systems that are installed in the country. So those are the main players. Then you get into some other ones like Generac is starting to get into solar, and Fronius, SMA, but they all represent about 10% at the moment. So the big players that we'll be studying are Enphase and SolarEdge. And when we do the hands-on thing at Eastern, we'll be working with both Enphase systems and with SolarEdge. So you'll work with all of the different systems that you run into. So at least you get your hands on them. So yeah, Brian.
So when we do the test, is that an open book test, or we have to have all this in our head?
Don't you wish? Don't you wish? No, no, it's closed book. I think, to me, that's better. That's good because, it's a lot easier. Open books usually, at least in my experience, were always a lot harder, a lot more finite detail. This is very generalized. But if you can answer the questions at the end of the chapter, you're going to be fine. You'll be fine on the test. So, just study those end questions. Now, in fact, I would say the questions I ask at the end of each chapter are a little bit more difficult than on the test, because many of my questions are intended to be a little bit tricky. And I also ask a lot of negative questions, like which of the following is not, and then I give you 3 of them that are and 1 that's not. But on the ETA exam, they will say which of the following is. They don't get into negatives because that can get confusing when you're in a test situation. So they'll say there are 4 choices, which one's true, as opposed to I'll say there are 4 choices, which one's false, which gets a little bit, it's a nuance, but it's definitely there. I also like to throw in tricky questions where I know what you're expecting to read. So there's one there later in one of the chapters where it says the AC disconnect, you'll learn that the AC disconnect has to be located within 10 feet of the electric meter. So that's the standard where it has to go. So my answer is, it says the AC disconnect has to be located at least 10 feet away from the meter. Well, I know that you're thinking within 10 feet when you read at least 10 feet away. And so I would say 50% of the students or more get that thing wrong because they're reading what they expect to read, not what's on the page. And that's kind of purposeful because then of course they'll remember it after they screw it up. So really I'm wanting you to mess these questions up ideally while you're taking it the first time, so that the second time you'll remember it more. We learn from our mistakes more than we learn from getting it right the first time. So, all right. Anybody else have any questions before we call it a day here? Yeah, Brian.
I'm not sure that I'm registered properly. I don't know if you can, I mean, I've taken one quiz so far and I've been working my way through it, and it lets me in where I can do it online, watch, with the audio and do it online. But I'm more attracted to the paper copy. That's the way I used to study when I was in school.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, all of you should have or will be receiving shortly the paper copies of the textbook. Now, the only downside that you have really is if you're doing the paper copy, you don't necessarily have the answers right there in front of you on the quizzes, but you can check them online. That's no problem. Yeah, if you can get into it, you're registered properly. And I know your name is on the list there from Eastern that they sent me. So you guys should all be set. But yeah, just keep plugging away at it and hopefully you won't run into any problems. I think we've got a full group and we're actually starting to fill up the next class. So there's another class coming up in a month, 1 month after at Eastern. So if you know anybody, any friends or anybody else that you want to refer into it, it's a super good deal you guys are getting through. They're subsidizing your registration and all of that. So if you can get some other friends or people motivated, I'd love to fill up that class as well. So become a herald to fill up the next edition of the class. So, all right. Well, we'll see you guys next Tuesday. And if you guys will, if you have any questions during the week, just send me an email and I'll get back to you on that. But then we'll meet at 1 o'clock next Wednesday.
Tuesday?
Right. Yep. Yeah. Oh, next Tuesday. Next Tuesday.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. I'll screw it up here before long. I'll get everybody confused. Yeah. 1 o'clock on Tuesdays. And you're welcome to join us at Solar Noon Tuesday, which is the hour before. Hopefully you're getting those notices, but we usually have pretty good discussion there. So you can make a day of it. Make some popcorn and sit back and enjoy 2 hours of delightful solar conversation. All right. Take care. Bye-bye.